In the frozen landscape of Finnish winter, 1885, the quiet croft of Efraim Martin in Ylöjärvi became the centre of local attention thanks to a series of unexplainable events that saw almost the entire neighbourhood crowd into the small farmhouse. Rumours of the devils and demons wound through the township as neighbours swore that they saw an invisible force cause havoc throughout the otherwise peaceful home. The stories spread like the winter frost, and soon the authorities themselves were forced to ask the question: was this trickery, or had the devil truly come to Ylöjärvi? This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories, Season 9, Episode, I think it's 18. I'm Ben, your host as always, and this week got a couple of little short notices. So first I'll just deal with the simple one. If you would like to take part in this year's Christmas campfire, now is probably the time to send your story in between now and December, but I'll start giving a quick shout out for it now. If you're new to the podcast and you're not sure what it is, this is something I do every year, every Christmas. I have been doing it for, I don't know how many seasons now, like 7 or 8 years, I guess, where listeners write in with their kind of creepy or otherwise sort of unusual stories, and I read them out, and the episode goes out on Christmas Eve. It's kind of a callback to that idea of, sitting around the fire on Christmas Eve reading ghost stories. Probably the best thing, if you're not sure what it is just go back and check out one of the old episodes, one of the old Christmas campfire episodes, and you'll get the idea. But yeah, if you would like to take part, I've already had a few emails. I haven't read any of them yet because I like to save them up. I just basically put them all into a separate email folder and then read them all for myself on Christmas because that way I get to enjoy the stories the same as you as well, which is, great. So yeah, like I say, I've had a few sent in. If you would like to send yours in, now is probably the time. If you can tag the subject, a Christmas campfire or something along those lines, just makes it easier for me to sort it into a folder that I can then sort of have all of the Christmas campfire stories all in one place. So yeah, if you would like to take part, that would be amazing. It's every year it's got better and better and better, and so just looking forward to this year's one as much as I look forward to every year, because they are one of my favourite episodes of the year. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is this episode actually was a suggestion from someone called, I think their name is pronounced Alexi, but I'm not entirely sure, from Patreon. And they suggested this during a sort of an impromptu Patreon live stream that I was doing a while back. And I just thought, I looked into it a bit and it just sort of slipped right into the kind of Halloween season vibe, I guess, of Dark History. So I thought I'd look straight into it. Now, before we do start, I do want to say, this was obviously all in Finnish, and I cannot speak Finnish. So the place names and things like that are going to be a little bit anglicised and probably wrong. So I apologise to Finnish listeners everywhere, and Swedish as well, because there's a lot of Swedish in this as well. So yeah, my deep apologies for butchering your language. I have spent time looking up the place names on YouTube, like travel videos, which is one way I like to find out how you pronounce stuff, because then you get the local pronunciation of everything. But it uses sounds that I just don't even know how to do. A prime example would be the sort of township name is Ylöjärvi. Well, that's how I would pronounce it. How a real Finnish person would pronounce it rolls a few R's in there and has a bit of a almost like glottal stop as well, so they're going to be slightly anglicised. So yeah, for English listeners or anyone that's not Finnish or Swedish, you're probably going to be fine with this episode. If you are Finnish or Swedish, like I said, I deeply apologise. On that note, let's get going. This episode is called The Martin's Croft Poltergeist, the Devil of Ylöjärvi. Finland in 1885, or the Grand Duchy of Finland as it was more accurately titled at the time, was in a politically and culturally transitional state with a strong and emerging national identity rising from the turbulence. Ceded to Russia from Sweden in 1809 following the Finnish War, Finland was an autonomous state of the Russian Empire, officially ruled by the Russian Emperor Alexander III, though it still adhered to its own codes of law, largely unchanged from the Swedish legal system that had been installed during the hundreds of years when it had been part of the Kingdom of Sweden. As such, Finnish culture was already built on a mix of influences, creating a distinctive nationalism built on language, folklore and religion, with Lutheranism dominating in the region as the national religion, quite separate from its Russian rulers. Socially, the elite still spoke Swedish, which had dominated the education system, with Finnish gradually reaching near parity. This separation from the Russian Empire was a growing source of tension in the region, thanks to the impatience with the Russian nationalists who eyed such a level of autonomy with suspicion. Despite this deep period of flux, Finland was joining the rapid industrialisation sweeping across Europe and Scandinavia, and the city of Tampere saw its economy propped up almost entirely by a single large textile factory that employed over half the city's population. In contrast to the cities, rural Finland was almost exclusively agrarian, with the bulk of the rural population employed as farmers and farmhands on tenant farms working small crofts that were rented from a wealthy landlord. Collections of disparate crofts built up villages, and collections of villages made up townships, each governed by the local parishes and administrative groups. Local populations were small, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone and reputations were closely guarded. Whilst infrastructure in the rural areas of Finland was still undergoing a stage of improvement, the rural population were not all just simply uneducated peasants, but the disparity in wealth and modern amenities between the cities and the countryside was another growing source of tension between the so-called enlightened elite classes in the cities and the rural populations who still adhered to many of the more folk and traditional beliefs that had dominated the countryside for centuries. That all said, spiritualism, which had been growing across the world, was still not a particularly popular belief, and the practice of exorcism, already a rarely carried out practice, was set to be banned. Alongside this, the death penalty had long since been removed from the punishments for witchcraft after witch trials had all but died out back in the 17th century. Despite all of this social and cultural upheaval, the winter of 1885 saw strange rumours brewing in the township of Ylöjärvi, as the residents of a small farmhouse known as Martin's Croft saw their story eventually find its way right to the top of the Finnish administration. In 1885, Ylöjärvi was a small township in southwest Finland with a population of less than 2,600 people, all separated by the rural landscape of rivers, lakes and forests into a collection of villages that sat 10 miles north of the city of Tampere, known today in Finnish as Tampere. The centre of Ylöjärvi was Ylöjärvi village, where the church sat proud as the religious and administrative headquarters for the township. Nearby, the local school served the community's education, and the inn served as a travel stop, a social hub, a courthouse and even a temporary jail cell if the situation was ever called for. Around 160 tenant crofts made up the small village hamlets dotted around Ylöjärvi village, one of the oldest of which was known as Kelijärvi, established on the eastern banks of Lake Kelijärvi. The small hamlet was primarily composed of 3 estates, each of which were further fractured into a series of crofts and homesteads. Located atop a small hill and surrounded by tall trees, sat Martin's Croft, rented and worked by Efraim Martin and his wife, Eva. The Martin's Croft farmhouse was a quaint, single-storey wood log building with a small gable-roofed entrance porch attached to one side and a long, thin chimney standing proud in the middle of the main roof. Inside and past the entrance porch, there were only 2 rooms. A sparsely decorated living room where Efraim kept a table, several chairs, a few cabinets, bookshelves, and a writing desk, which is where he sat and worked on his legal cases. There was also a kitchen, complete with a stove, a table, and more chairs. In the roof, rafters split the rooms from the disused attic space above, which the Martins used to dry wood for the splint candles that they used to light the house, which was, like most Finnish buildings of the time, minus a few factories in Tampere, absent of any electrical lighting. Efraim Martin was well known in the local area, and he enjoyed a good reputation. 16 years earlier, when many Finnish parishes had begun separating from their wider administrative leaders, a brief meeting was held in Ylöjärvi village following the Sunday religious service, where the new local administration was put into place, and Efraim Martin was elected as the township chair. Born in 1814, Efraim had had a winding career around Ylöjärvi. The second youngest of 7 children, He began his working life learning the craft of shoemaking from his elder brother, which served him well for much of his life, eventually working as a shoemaker with 2 apprentices. Throughout his time as a shoemaker, he was a keen member of the local community, and he ran a project to rebuild the local church after it burnt down in a fire caused by a lightning strike. Despite having no formal education to speak of, Efraim also used his skills in reading and writing Swedish and Finnish, along with his position of good standing in the community, to take on legal work, writing up contracts and documentation, and even representing clients in court. Eventually, this legal work built from a side gig into a full-blown income, and Efraim shifted further into community work, taking on the role of secretary for the Poor Relief Fund and applying to become the church warden in 1847. His successful election was the first of a series that kept him as warden for 21 years, placing him in prime position to take on the chairman of the township upon its founding in 1869. Later that year, he also started teaching, finally retiring completely as a shoemaker. After teaching across 2 schools, both community and private, he retired 10 years later at the age of 65, retreating to his Croft, where he continued to focus on legal work and his position as a township chair. Along the way, Efraim married Eva Martin in June of 1839. Ava's mother had been a maid, and Eva had been born as an illegitimate child, eventually becoming a maid herself until her marriage to Efraim. The couple settled down together, having 5 children, a son born in 1842, a pair of twin daughters 4 years later, a third daughter in 1849, and a final son in 1851. Sadly, the twins failed to live past infancy, though the rest of their sons and daughters did make it to adulthood and move out of home to the city of Tampere, where they worked in the city. By 1885, Efraim Martin rented the Croft from Efraim Irola, who had taken over the estate in 1863. Living just half a kilometre from the Martin Croft house, Efraim Martin and Irola quickly became close friends outside of their professional relationship, with Irola acting as godfather to several of Martin's children. The Martin's Croft was one of 6 rented out by Irola, and aside from the main Croft house, the Martin Croft consisted of several outbuildings, including a small livestock barn, an outhouse and several sheds. With both children having long since moved away, the farmhouse was small but cosy, and Efraim and Eva Martin shared the space with their new maidservant, 13-year-old Emma Lindrus, who slept on the floor of the lounge in a makeshift bed nearby Ava's. Emma had been born in 1871. Her mother and only brother had died when she was still young, and later her father married their maidservant, who unfortunately died just 2 years later. He had just married his third wife, another maidservant 20 years his junior, when Emma moved in with the Martins to take on her role as maid in 1884. Together, the 3 lived a fairly austere existence on the Martins' Croft, with little excitement in their day-to-day lives. At least, that was until the winter of 1885, when things suddenly took a fairly unexpected turn towards the bizarre. The winter of 1884 and 85 had been particularly long in Ylöjärvi. Snowfall had come in October of 1884, and by January the lakes and rivers across Finland had been frozen over long enough that travel around the country had been made significantly quicker, as people could cut their journey time by walking across the thick ice. In winter, the sun rose around 9 a.m. and set around 3 p.m, the short days never really brightening up like summer months. In the Martins' Croft house, the Martins lit their way through the winter gloom using homemade splint candles, fashioned from slim cuts of oiled wood, which burnt like a dim candle, bringing a warm orange glow to the shadowy little farmhouse. On the evening of Sunday the 11th of January, Eva Martin was getting ready for bed, making sure the kitchen stove was cooled and the fireplace in the living room was falling to dying embers. Emma Lindrus, the maidservant, had already crept into her bed on the floor in the corner of the room, and Efraim was out working somewhere in one of the sheds on the Croft. As Eva sat on the sheets to pull herself under the covers, she paused for a moment, focusing on a noise that she thought she heard in the corner of the room. As she strained her ears, staring into the shadows, a loud bang rang out across the room, and the door to the entryway porch flew open, slamming into the living room wall. After recovering from the brief startling of the loud noise, she stepped back out of bed and peered out into the entryway. Seeing no one around, she closed the door and double-checked the lock before heading back to bed, putting the slight puzzlement out of her mind, sure that she had already locked the door for the night. She assumed that the door had caught a sudden draft, and then slowly she drifted off to sleep. When the door burst open a second time that night, Efraim had already returned from outside. Both the Martins jumped up at the second loud bang, and Ava, now convinced that something must have been wrong with the door, slipped out of bed once more, and after making a precautionary peep into the entryway, she closed the door behind her and made her way to the fireplace to stoke the dying embers, lighting some kindling and filling the room with a soft orange glow. As the flames cast shadows into the room, both Ava and Efraim noticed what looked like small lumps of plaster scattered across the floor. This was bad news, as it could only have come from either the walls or the ceiling, but in the dim light neither looked especially damaged. Figuring that they'd check it in the morning in the light of day, they both returned to bed and slept in the warmth of the fire. That was until just before dawn, when the door flung open for the final time that night, waking everyone with a disgruntled start. Ava, by now, was thoroughly unamused at what she thought must be a faulty lock. She got up once more and closed the door and returned to an uneasy sleep. Later that morning, once the sun had risen across the Croft, the Martins set about checking over the plaster they'd seen the night before. Now, with the aid of the sunlight, they were convinced that the numerous small lumps looked just like plaster from their house, but as far as either could tell, there was no damage. Sure, there were the usual cracks in the walls, but nothing that hadn't been there before. It was a relief on one hand, but all rather puzzling on the other. Efraim had checked as best as he could, though his attention had been a little removed after he found a whole slew of his documents, which should ordinarily have been shut up in his writing desk, had been strewn about across the living room floor. Gathering the papers, he shuffled over to the desk, pulled open the drawers, and slipped the papers back inside. Before turning back to the plaster, he circled the drawers with a thin rope, tying it off just to make sure that they could not open so easily in future. The pair then spent the next hour or so gathering all the broken bits of plaster into a basket and lumped them outside into the yard. Efraim had found the whole morning somewhat confusing. The sheer amount of plaster he had tossed into the yard should have been noticeable if it had been chipped out of the walls or ceiling of the house, but everything had looked just as solid as it always had. Still, he tried to put the riddle out of his mind and he got on with his day. Unfortunately for the Martins, the strange mystery of the appearing plaster was only the first of a series of unusual and unexplainable events that took place over the next few days. The bedclothes, usually kept tight on the beds in the corner of the living room, were found in a rumpled pile in the middle of the room, as if tossed aside, though no one had been around to actually do such a thing. Meanwhile, Efraim seemed to lose track of his keys on several occasions, despite being sure that he'd put them down on the table every time. On each occasion, just as he spent several minutes looking around the small farmhouse, the keys appeared suddenly, back exactly where he had left them, as if they had simply vanished and reappeared from thin air. These were more annoyances than anything particularly troubling. However, when a wooden water pail skidded across the living room floor, completely of its own volition, a new concern became apparent. And it wasn't just a water pail either. Shortly after they were recovering from the sight of their utensils moving of their own accord, a potato basket was flung into the centre of the room, and when Ava grabbed hold of it to stop it moving, the potatoes themselves began to fly out one by one, as if tossed by an invisible hand. By this point, both Efraim and Eva were quite sure something untoward was happening in their house, and it was a theory that only grew in conviction and fear when tremors began sounding beneath the floorboards, so violent at times that the sound of the cutlery and dishes rattling in the kitchen cut through the thick silence. Efraim knew that there could not have been anything beneath the house, as there was no basement, and the house was built on stone. But this didn't stop the rumbling sound intensifying. A coffee cup fell from the table and crashed onto the floor, breaking in the fall, along with a coffee pot that was thrown from the stove. The mysterious noises seemed to be coming from all sides too. At other times, when the rumbling had ceased, large thumping sounds were heard in the attic, banging across the ceiling of the room like something moving across the roof of the house. It was with some relief that Emma's aunt, Josefina Henriksdotter, came to visit on Tuesday the 13th of January to visit her niece, breaking the fearful, anxious atmosphere that had begun to creep across the small Croft. Whether or not the Martins had chosen to speak to Josefina about the strange happenings is unsure, but regardless, she soon found out in a more direct way. As she was sitting by the table, she watched as a matchbox slipped across the wooden surface before flipping up into the air and then launching itself across the room, slapping into the wall and falling flat onto the writing desk. When she returned the next morning, she actually said she saw the key in the lock of the living room door turn by itself, lift out of the keyhole, and then, just like the matchbox, fly across the room and then land on the floor by her feet. Unsurprisingly, she didn't hang around long after that, which was rather fortunate as, that afternoon, the Martins found the entire house covered in a thin layer of clay plaster dust. By now, Efraim had spoken with his friend and landlord, Efraim Irola, who paid the small Croft a visit that afternoon, just in time to find Eva and Efraim scraping piles of the dust into a wicker basket. Fascinated, Irola inspected the windows, where he found the thin layer of dust covering the panes in such a uniform way that he described it as looking as though it had been painted on. Helping with the clean-up effort, the three of them spent the afternoon filling 3 full baskets with the thick dust, which they unceremoniously dumped outside. Intrigued by what he had seen, Irola began visiting the Croft house daily, checking in on the Martins and keeping close tabs on any unusual activity. Luckily for him, there didn't seem to be a shortage. The very next day, he witnessed a knife fly from the entryway of the living room and barely skim his face as it cracked into the rear wall behind him. Far from finding this experience worrying, he instead returned home and recalled the story to his wife, recommending her to visit to go and see for herself. The next day, he sat by the table in the living room and saw a small collection of medicine bottles rattle and dance across the flat top, some of which toppled over and poured their caustic contents out onto the wood, causing them to bubble and foam. The same evening, Irola visited again, this time with a pair of his farm hands in tow, where all three watched as a wooden plate crashed onto the floor, seemingly fallen from the kitchen table all by itself. Unsurprisingly, in such a small community, word quickly began to spread. Once Irola and his farmhands had begun talking, the Martins were soon being visited from all corners of the township, as more and more people wanted to see the unusual events for themselves and make up their own minds as to what was happening. The whispered rumours were quick to equate it to demons, or at the very least, they were quick to admit that unseen forces were in operation. But precisely what those forces were, there was no solid consensus. On Thursday, Irola visited again with another local, a tailor named Gustav, who had also rented a croft on his estate. At the time, Efraim Martin and Emma, the housemaid, were present when a small carpenter's handsaw appeared to fly across the room from nowhere and crash onto the floor. The saw was placed onto the bed before it was tossed once more onto the floor, this time along with a knife. Gustav was not entirely sold by what he'd been seeing. On both occasions, he thought there was a possibility that the tools had been thrown by Emma, but his doubts were somewhat quashed after he witnessed a small piece of soot-covered iron, apparently broken from a candle holder, spin across the room, flying through the air, before sharply turning, acutely changing direction, and then thumping into the floor. The rattle on the wood shook Gustav from his stupor, his doubts now firmly behind him. By Saturday, just 6 days after the events had begun, Martin's Croft began receiving visitors from even further afield, thanks in the most part to Irola and his constant invitations to all and sundry, as people began trekking through the cold winter snow for more than a mile to see the phantom disturbances for themselves. That Saturday, Irola's wife, Eva, decided to take up her husband's recommendation, and she visited the Croft house to see Eva Martin. As the two sat in the kitchen, they heard a low, rumbling sound erupt from the living room. Eva Irola left Mrs. Martin in the kitchen casting candles, while she slowly moved towards the door into the living room, pulling it open and stepping through. No sooner had the door creaked shut behind her, 2 loud thumps crashed through the room, coming from the door that she'd just closed. Opening it again, she looked back into the kitchen, where she saw Eva Martin still seated at the table and watching the doorway. At Eva Irola's feet were 2 large bricks, which presumably had just bounced from the door and fallen onto the floor. As she stood staring at the bricks, somewhat pale-faced and perplexed, a broom crashed into the room from the entryway porch. Ava inched her way to the door, but found no one to pin either of the happenings on. As she stepped back across the room towards the kitchen, she heard Mrs. Martin in a state of some panic, grasping at the candles she had cast as they appeared to be pulled from her hands and tossed into the air. As Mrs. Irola rushed to help her, the wooden plates fell from the shelves, crashing onto the floor, adding to the chaotic scene. That evening, after Mrs. Irola had left, more local visitors made their way up to the farmhouse, where a blacksmith named Gerhard Gronfers arrived alongside Gustav, who, coming back for more, had been doing his own part in spreading the news. On this occasion, Gustav saw an awl fly across the room, though Gerhard seemed less impressed. Perhaps even more sceptical than Gustav, who had already been convinced during his last visit, Gerhard watched over Eva Martin carefully, sure that she had been the one to have thrown the awl, when a pair of women's shoes began to tumble across the floor, just like they were walking, one foot, then the other, in a clumsy fashion, until they reached the centre of the room, where they stopped and fell limp. Gerhard collected the shoes uneasily, turning them over in his hands, when a book of psalms belonging to Efraim Martin leapt from the bookshelf and hit the door. Uneasy with this blasphemous element of a religious text being cast about willy-nilly, Gerhard promptly left, and much like Gustav before him, he was no longer suspicious of the Martins. The next morning, he returned with a small party of people, including Efraim Irola, Irola's 21-year-old son, and 2 of their farmhands. It was still early, and the sun had yet to rise when they had all trunched through the front door, uncaring that Emma the maid was still asleep in bed. The group hung around all day, where they witnessed another pair of boots move across the room, just as the woman's shoes had done the night before. Just as before, they lolloped uneasily across the room in plain sight, before coming to a standstill right in the middle of the crowd, who all watched on with some degree of amazement. Following the boots, the Croft house did fall silent for some time, until later that evening, just as everyone's patience was beginning to wane, a measuring stick hanging on the wall from a screw began swinging left to right like a clock pendulum, sending out a steady, rhythmic ticking that would at random moments stop and start completely untouched. That evening had also seen the return of Josephina Lindrus, who, visiting her niece once again, was treated to the terrifying sensation of someone tugging at her foot underneath the table. Jumping and pulling herself back and peering beneath the wood, she saw nothing there, and nobody was close enough to have touched her leg without her noticing. As the days ticked by, and the visitors came and went, things never seemed to let up for the Martins at all. Several days later, now firmly into the second week of the disturbances, Efraim woke one morning to discover a rope tied around all of his sheep in the barn. Wrapping round each leg, the animals were bound tightly together, unable to walk from the bindings. Perhaps just as concerning for the Martins, however, was the more earthly appearances. By now, people had been visiting the Croft from as far away as the city of Tampafort. This was 10 miles away, and then, just days after the first city visitors, the Tampafort morning newspaper, the Amuleti, printed the first newspaper report of the farm. Headlined "The Devil's Tricks, Superstition or Spiritism," the piece was not altogether serious, nor was it in any way factual. Taking the rumours that had been coming from the farm and running with them, they suggested that the Croft house was being visited by the devil himself, and that Efraim had contacted a local priest for an exorcism, but had been turned down out of fear. Unsurprisingly, the report opened the floodgates to the Croft house, and within days, groups of people were visiting, 10 at a time. Often they were drunk, and often they were complete strangers to the Martins or anyone else in Ylöjärvi. The Martins, doing their best to accommodate everyone, welcomed as many as possible, but before long the house found itself packed from dawn till night, day after day. Rumours were growing that the Martins were making a pretty penny from the tips that they received as they offered up beds for the out-of-town visitors, and soon the rumours began to turn against the couple. Still, nothing seemed to stop the strange events, and despite the tight crowds, more and more unusual happenings were manifesting, often with increasingly destructive effects. Glasses, dishes, and Ephraim's proud collection of religious texts that he had managed to acquire through his brother's religious bookshop in Tampaford were all being smashed, crashed, and torn up on a daily basis as they were thrown through the air or tossed against walls for the amusement of the ever-increasing visitors. One morning, Ephraim woke to find his entire book collection rounded up and tossed into the kitchen stove. Concerned for his belongings, and with some exasperation, he hired a night watchman to keep an eye over the house, but after the armed guard fired off 3 shots into the wall, believing that he'd seen a silhouette creeping through the shadows, the experiment met a premature end. Tired of all this commotion, Ephraim left the house entirely, opting instead to get some distance from everything by staying with his son in Tampaford for 2 days. During his absence, a host of visitors witnessed the ale barrel in the kitchen spill its contents into a nearby tub, the tap having apparently vanished from the front of the vessel, which had been rendered completely unfit for service. Everyone present had filtered into the kitchen to watch as Ava and Emma worked to plug the barrel, and yet when they returned to the empty living room, the whole place appeared to have been turned upside down in a matter of moments, with various small items strewn across the floor and several of Ephraim's books torn and tossed about, their pages scattered across the floor. Upon Ephraim's return to the Croft from Tampaford 2 days later, things had, seemingly, begun to quiet down on the Croft. This, however, was in stark contrast to the news of the events, which had by now spread from one newspaper in Tampaford to newspapers in towns and cities across the country. Just like the early piece in the Amuletti, they too took little stock in Martin's claims, nor in any of the rumours, and several outright blamed the Martins for hoaxing the whole affair. Others suggested the events had been a wake-up call for the Martins, who perhaps needed to reform their ungodly ways. Not taking too kindly to these stories, Ephraim began considering a rebuttal, whilst he continued to accommodate visitors to the Croft, who, by and large, had been leaving disgruntled after a very quiet weekend. Unfortunately for the Martins, the newspapers were not the only ones catching wind of the story, and by now the local administration had begun to feel that the commotion at the Croft was getting out of hand. Fearing for the safety of the community, the County Crown Sheriff, Casimir Liljestrand, who had been keeping an eye on the Croft house throughout the events, wrote a letter to the governor of the province. To Herr Governor of the province, an incident as unusual as it is dreadful, which has aroused both horror and amazement in the township, and which began at night on the eve of the 12th of this month, and has since that day, with the exception of a few intervals, continued uninterruptedly, occurred on the aforementioned night at the residence of the chairman of Ylöjärvi's Township Assembly, former folk school teacher Efraim Martin. The letter detailed several of the occurrences witnessed across the previous 2 weeks, and then continued. The incident has attracted an abundance of people from near and far who want to convince themselves of the disturbances there. Some have returned with, whilst others without, successful results. I have also personally visited the site several times without experiencing anything of the kind I have mentioned here other than obvious traces, which I may humbly report to Herr Governor. This letter may have seemed relatively innocuous, but it was quite clear that the sheriff was looking to escalate the issue to the wider administration. If he had written the letter out of fear for the community, then his fears were soon realised, after a group of drunk visitors visited the farmhouse on the night of Monday the 26th of January, and a collection of household items were seen to toss themselves into the stove, where they burst into flames. Later that night, a drunken group of men from Tampaford found their way to the Croft, where one, brandishing a knife, began to swing it around the tightly packed living room, threatening to stab the demons if they were present. And then, in a clear display of either his drunkenness or stupidity, and perhaps both, he threatened another visitor, accusing him of being the devil. Later that night, the same group of men stopped off at an inn on their way home for a drink, where a man named Ernest von Notbeck was stabbed to death. Ignoring all of the facts of the events, especially the drunken state of the men involved, rumours quickly began to spread that the demons from the Martins' Croft had possessed this group and caused them to murder. Meanwhile, back at the Croft, and now deeply concerned for his reputation, Efraim Martin had invited the local church verger up to the farm to assist him in writing his own version of the events of the previous 2 weeks, which he hoped to send to the Tampere newspapers in order to refute some of the more outrageous claims that had been published concerning him and his family. That night, the 2 men witnessed a stool bounce up and down, slamming into the floor and tumbling over and over as it leapt into the air. Hoping to find peace and quiet, the 2 men took their work down to one of the outhouses, whilst Efraim Martin and the maid Emma tried their best to placate the verger's wife, who was getting into an increasingly panicked state having seen the bouncing stool. By the time that the 2 men were finished with their story, they met the verger's wife storming from the house after she had just witnessed a series of small items tear through the air, apparently thrown by no one. Back inside the house, the sound of crashing echoed into the garden, and when the 2 men rushed inside, they saw the table leaping up from the ground and slamming itself back down into the wooden floor with such force that the whole house shook and dust fell from the rafters. With the verger's help, Efraim managed to rope down the table, which, after a good struggle, finally seemed to fall still. In one last hurrah, the next morning, the Martins woke to find Emma the maid tied up with the same rope, knotted at several different points around her body. It had been a frightening night, but fortunately for the Martins, it was the last. After 2 weeks of constant commotion, whatever had been wreaking havoc in the small house appeared to fall silent for good. The Martins may have been able to finally breathe a sigh of relief, but in truth, it was only the beginning of their troubles. As the days had been passing in chaos and trouble at the Croft, the Crown Sheriff's letter had been winding its way to the governor, who now had his own orders for the fate of the smallhold's occupants, and it was not good news for any of them. In the days following the disturbing events at the Martins' Croft farmhouse, the uneasy quiet had brought little relief to Efraim Martin. The newspapers had refused to publish his letter, giving his side of the story, and worse, papers from across the country were still printing more and more sensational and sometimes snarky reports. Some wrote of how the demons were turning water into liquor for the visitors to drink, whilst others called Efraim out for being part of a hoax. Still more said that the demon had fled the Martins' Croft and instead installed itself in towns and cities across Finland where it was causing fresh havoc. These accusations were more of a big deal than they might have seemed, as there was actually very few places that were licensed to distribute liquor, and the Croft House was certainly not one of them. If nothing else, Efraim felt that the stories were damaging his reputation and destroying his business providing legal services to the community. Further, Emma Lindris had fallen ill with consumption, and her father had come to pick her up and take her home, leaving the elderly Martins with no maidservant help around the home. Thankfully, as February had worn on, and with no new events to report, the streams of visitors had eventually dried up, and it even seemed like the newspapers were beginning to grow tired of the story. On the flip side, the Crown Sheriff received a reply from the Governor on the 24th of February regarding the affair, and the administrative orders were not good news for the Martins. In the letter dated January the 24th, Herr Crown Sheriff has reported on specific disturbances that have occurred in the house of a few days at the residence of former folk school teacher Efraim Martin in Ylöjärvi chapelry. Since the architects of these disturbances now appear to have been Martin's wife and a girl residing with them, Herr Crown Sheriff is ordered to conduct a more thorough investigation into the matter, and particularly into if hard liquor had been dispensed to the people visiting the place, as has been reported, and thereby prosecute the guilty in the appropriate court of law. Apparently, it was fairly clear that the Governor had been keeping a somewhat keen eye of his own on the events of the Martins' Croft, only he had seemingly based everything that he knew on it on some of the more scathing rumours that had been published over the previous weeks. With no rebuttal ever published from Efraim, he was now forced into telling his story to a courtroom instead. The investigation was not especially great news for the Crown Sheriff either, who policed the entire county by himself with only one other law officer. Still, orders were orders, and so the sheriff began to round up a collection of witnesses who would be willing to speak in a court of law of their experiences at the Croft House. At least he had time on his side, as the investigation and trial was set to conclude at the Winter Assizes, which were scheduled to begin on the 18th of March and last for a full week, with the Martins scheduled to appear on the final day. It was looking to be a busy session, and the Martins case was only one of 80 cases scheduled to be pored over by the 5 jurymen who assisted the High Court judge in carrying out his rulings. After hearing a long series of relatively minor cases, the makeshift court, assembled in the home of an estate owner in the nearby village of Suyanen, finally got to hear the unusual tale of Martin's Croft as the 17th case of the day on the afternoon of the 24th of March. Unsurprisingly, this 6th day of the assizes had seen a generous uptick in attendance from the locals, who all came to see what the Martins had to say for themselves concerning the, by now fairly infamous demons that had been supposedly causing chaos on his smallholding. To open proceedings, the prosecutor, who also happened to have been the Crown Sheriff, read out the charges to the room. On account of Herr Provincial Governor's letter, number 3550, addressed to me on February the 23rd, I have summoned to this court the chairman of the township assembly here, former folk school teacher Efraim Martin, along with his wife, Eva Martin, and their underage servant girl, Emma Lindrus, for they have been charged with having, from Monday the 12th of the last January, for the duration of a couple of weeks, themselves been the instigators of all the disturbances that had occurred during the aforementioned time period at their residence, which were allegedly brought about by the devil, and had been attracted thereto curious visitors from near and far, to whom hard liquor had been dispensed on that same occasion. The defendants were then called into the court to meet their captive audience, or at least they would have been had they all been there. Emma Lindrus, who had fallen sick towards the end of January, was apparently still too sick to attend the court. With her mortality thought to be fast approaching, her absence was, in a somewhat dark judgment, decided to be of little consequence, and the trial was allowed to continue. Finally, Ava and Efraim Martin were given free rein to speak their piece and give their side of the story, which they did with full conviction. Walking the court through the events of the 2 weeks in January, insisting that they had never held any superstitious beliefs, that they'd never been part of any cult or any non-traditional religions, and that neither had ever been part of any hoax. Instead, they pinned the events on what they called an unknown force of nature. For the record, they also insisted that Emma had always been too sickly and also too simple to have carried out any hoax on her own. Ephraim also used the opening speech to insist that he had never profited from the events, and had, in fact, only ever lost money thanks to all the damage to his property that the events had carried out, along with the loss of earnings from his legal work, which he believed had taken a hit thanks to the accusational reporting in the newspapers. With their story told, the next step was for the prosecutor to pull out a long string of witnesses, 15 in total, that he had gathered together as the Crown Sheriff. Amongst them were witnesses of the Martins Croft events from all walks of life, including Irola the landlord, his wife and son, as well as the blacksmith and tailor Gerhard and Gustav. There was also Gerhard's sister, Matilda. There were maidservants, shoemakers, farmhands, and of course the church verger and his previously terrified wife. The rest of the session had each one recount the things that they had seen at the Croft house, with 12 of them ascribing the events witnessed to have been carried out to what they referred to as an incomprehensible invisible force. 2 others said that they'd not seen anything unusual during their visit, and only one said that they were unsure as to who had carried out the events, but thought it could possibly have been Emma the maid playing a prank. Not a single witness said that they had ever seen the Martins sell, give out, or in any other way dispense liquor to any of the visitors, and several were keen to impress that the Martins had always been good, reputable members of the community. In one of the more bizarre turns for the case, a collection of rocks were entered into evidence during the trial, which Efraim Martin had said were not natively present on the Croft, and that he believed they had been brought to the house from the nearby mountain by spirits. With little else to follow but the closing statements, the Martins once more repeated their pleas for innocence, and impressing that on a few occasions Emma the maid had played pranks on some of the visitors, she had always made it clear at the time that she had been trying to have some fun, and that otherwise no one had had any hand in anything. The jury's deliberations lasted just moments before a verdict was returned, and the Martins were found not guilty on both charges. In the court's opinion, No crime against existing laws and regulations can be regarded to have occurred, even if the accused had committed such pranks by using secret hatches, hidden wires, or other tricks. And even less can the provisions in the Criminal Code's Chapter 2, Section 2, regarding witchcraft and superstition be applied to the present court case, since it has been demonstrated that the defence neither benefited from the events, nor had they caused injury to others, and neither had the defendants claimed to have employed the help of some supernatural force, as stated in the above-mentioned Criminal Code provisions. Likewise, the accusations regarding illegal sale of hard liquor has also been found to have no basis. This was an interesting conclusion, with the court not actually conceding the existence of any supernatural force, but rather that the Martins had not been caught deceiving people, nor had they sold anyone alcohol. Naturally, the press were none too happy with this ruling, who, after slamming the Martins for several weeks, now found the case rule against their side of the story. Several papers threw out fresh accusations, and one even accused the rural court system of being unfit for purpose, stating that every friend of the Enlightenment had been transformed into justified resentment when the outcome of the trial became known. As it happened, they still may have gotten their way, as the case was still actually open, following the trial transcript being sent to the High Court for affirmation. Whilst this took 6 months, the result did return in favour of the Martins, and in September of that year, they were officially acquitted. The events at the Croft had consumed almost a full 9 months, but finally, for the Martins, everything was over. The court ruling quickly saw the end of the Martins Croft affair, and by the time of the High Court ruling later that year, the press and the public had all but moved on with their lives. The Martins too had returned to a fairly normal life. Just 2 days after their court appearance, Efraim Martin was actually back in court, this time working as a legal representative. Efraim continued to work as the township chair, being re-elected twice before his eventual death, which came in 1890 at the age of 76. Ava, his wife, had already passed away a few months prior at the age of 81. Shortly after their deaths, the Martin Croft house was dismantled and the lumber was transported across the lake where it was reused to build another house. Today, a sign stands at the original site where the foundations can barely be seen. Despite many rumours stating otherwise, some of which still persist to this day, Emma Lindrews, the Martins' maid, didn't actually die at the time of the trial. And though she never really recovered from her sickness, which had seen her excused from court, she did live for another 10 years, before finally succumbing to consumption in 1895 at the young age of 23. A full transcript of the Martins' trial was published in 1891, which saw fresh light shone onto the case, and has, ever since, helped to keep the affair alive in folklore and legend. Many theories have been put forward over the years as to what was going on and what happened at the trial. Was it that the sheriff had cherry-picked a selection of witnesses likely to have been positive towards the Martins, either to pull a stand-up member of the community from a tight spot, or to perhaps strengthen the sheriff's own conviction of the things that he'd seen at the Croft house? Others question why Emma skipped court at all when she was clearly healthier than what was let on. For the skeptics, there are countless theories as to who carried out which hoax, and for the believers, as many theories exist debating exactly what kind of supernatural entity had been at play, with the main culprits being either a demon or a poltergeist. As always, the truth went to the grave with the Martins and their maid. But thanks to the court transcripts, published multiple times and in multiple languages over the 140 years since the events, the devil of Ylöjärvi, as it came to be known, remains well alive and shows no sign of ever fading away. So that was the story of the Martins Croft poltergeist, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yes, a lot to talk about, I guess. Well, a bit to talk about. Firstly, I will say that as I mentioned, I don't speak Finnish or Swedish, and you needed to be able to speak both to be able to look at the primary or even secondary sources of this case, because some were written in Finnish and some in Swedish. And some were written in Finnish with Swedish sort of almost like leftover Swedish like loan words or something. Which was so yeah, that was quite difficult. What made it even more difficult, however, was but it was quite cool. Was I discovered the original newspapers that reported on this were all printed with this like awesome like Gothic font, which looked super cool, but just made it even harder to read. So I was trying to read these like basically these Finnish newspapers and trying to pick out like random words that I knew or recognised, and then I would like then translate it like with like an automatic translator and try and like dig out its meaning from there, and then with the help of a dictionary sort of translate it a bit more properly, but still a rough translation if you like. But yeah, having to like read through the newspapers with this thick Gothic font was not made any easier. That was just a small interesting thing I noticed anyway. Understandably, this case has reached basically legend status, and there's a ton of misinformation and mess. This is pretty much thanks largely to the newspaper reports of the day, which there were so many quite believable rumours swirling around that were made up by the papers. So some of them actually giving people's names and stuff, but turns out that none of it was actually true. So yeah, it's definitely very much mixed up story. For me, I think the most likely situation, if we're going to sort of say, what happened, I think the most likely situation was that it was an incredibly dim light in the house, right? We had the Martins using these very sort of makeshift oiled wood candles, which wouldn't have given off a great deal of light. This would have certainly helped to conceal people that might have been throwing things, right? Maybe it started with Emma. Maybe everyone in the Martins household was in on it. Maybe it was Irola who seemed to be enjoying it. The landlord, he seemed to be having a good time. And then later, it could have been any one of the visitors who were either looking to sort of prank their friends or just sort of be part of it. At times, there were over 10 people cramped into this small house, all lit by dim candlelight. I just don't think you could really keep track of every single one of them all of the time. Now, I think something that backs this up, and I don't think it's a particular surprise, was that the conclusion of all the events happened at exactly the same time that things started turning badly for Efraim, and also when Emma fell sick. So I'm not saying it was one of them or both of them, but it's incredibly convenient that the time that Emma was too sick to really get out of bed and that things were going badly for Efraim, all of a sudden all this stuff stopped. It's also true that Emma had admitted to playing pranks on a few occasions. Now, the Martins in court said that she always admitted these pranks at the time and was like, she would throw something across the room and then say like, oh, no, it's just me playing prank. I was just teasing you or whatever. Obviously, the most obvious answer to that is that she only admitted to playing the pranks when she got caught, right? So all the other times, she just wasn't caught. And so she didn't need to admit the pranks because no one was caught. And so I think that lends to it. So to me, I feel like it's quite obvious that someone was throwing stuff around. The bigger question for me in all of this, and the bigger mystery for me, is why would they do it? In a lot of these kind of cases, when you go back to like the 16th, 17th century, even the 18th and 19th centuries, you see a lot of these cases were sort of driven by religious motives. You see priests or parishioners or some kind of clergyman writing up pamphlets that spice the stories up, and they filled the pamphlets with like religious moralizing, and they promoted people to lead like religious lives. And so you see all of this quite clearly. But here, there was nothing really like that. I don't really think the sale of alcohol was a thing. I think that was all made up in the stories. But I do think perhaps people were drunk there, and I do think perhaps Efraim did profit from putting these people up for the night with a bed. It said that he would always accommodate people and that he was getting tipped from it. Whether or not he really needed that money, though, is another question. He seemed to be doing all right for himself. So was profit really his sort of main motive? Again, I don't necessarily think so. Was it just a prank that got out of hand? I just don't really see that either. So it is a curious mystery, why they would have done it. I feel like there's probably some kind of sociological reason that I'm not seeing here, like that I'm missing some piece of information that explains why they might have wanted to do it. I don't really see it straight away, though. So I don't think profit was a main motive for him, but I do think it's quite clearly a hoax. I mean, on the other hand, maybe it wasn't a hoax and all this crazy stuff was really happening. For me, I can't buy into that on this occasion, but maybe you can, and that's fine. If you would like to write to me to tell me how terrible my Finnish pronunciations were, then you can do so. If you would also like to write to me for any other reason, you could also do so. The email is contact@darkhistories.com. And yeah, if you have any theories, then chip in and let me know. You also want to use that same email address if you, like I said at the start of the episode, have a Christmas campfire story to submit. It's contact@darkhistories.com. You can find that email in the show notes, along with links to social media and the main Dark Histories website, darkhistories.com. And there you'll find like links to everything, like ways that you can support the show, whether that be through Patreon for like ad-free episodes and bonus episodes and things like that, or through just leaving a review or just telling your friends, things like that. All that stuff is a massive support for me and helps me a great deal with this little project. So yeah, otherwise, outside from that, I don't think there's a lot more to say. Thank you very much for listening. As always, I will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. So until then, as always, thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are Finnish or Swedish and you thought my pronunciation was tough to listen to, I do apologise. Hopefully it was just about bearable and you could make it this far. So yeah, thanks as always for listening. Until next time, take care, sleep tight.